Again, a very good afternoon, good evening, or good morning from whichever part of the world or the Asia Pacific that you are joining in. Thanks so much for joining us for this webinar today. We are really happy to see you all. I'm Kamakshi. I'm the program officer for the Women in Power program at the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, or APWLD. I also have my colleagues, Sanila, Rose, and Zarzar, who are helping us run the show smooth today. Thanks everyone for joining us for this important webinar titled A World Without Militarism, Grassroots Women's Vision and Demands for Feminist Peace and Justice. Before we move ahead, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to share that the webinar is going to be in English. We request you all to keep yourself on mute while the webinar is ongoing, but obviously you can keep the conversations going on in the chat. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And in case you have any comments, inputs, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we have 5 speakers with us for the webinar today, and we'll also have a question and answer session, a brief one, depending on how much time we have, once all the speakers are done. So you can have your questions answered at the end. You can also see a Q&A tab at the bottom. So if you want, when the speakers are speaking, if you want to put in any questions, you can use the Q&A tab and put in your questions, and we'll take it after all the speakers are done. So without further ado, I'll just start with the webinar and also introduce our speakers. So this webinar, as you see, it's titled A World Without Imperialism, Grassroots Women's Vision and Demands for Feminist Peace and Justice. APWLD, as a feminist and membership-based organization, has been working on unpacking the layers of militarism within the Asia-Pacific region. And we have been having multiple conversations with our members, allies, and other regional and global organizations over the past few years. And these conversations and deliberations have really made us reflect that a world without militarism is really not possible without overthrowing imperialism, capitalism, and neoliberalism from our region. And really, these structures of oppression are very, very interconnected. And this is what we really want to bring forward our feminist analysis on militarism and imperialism through this webinar today, uh, and really to touch upon some of the very crucial issues that interconnect imperialism and militarism, especially for the Asian Pacific region. We will touch upon issues of the military-industrial complex, the war profiteering, and by the weapons-producing corporations and nations, which is really, really a very key demand for feminist peace and justice from our region. There's also another issue of extraction of resources and labor for profiteering of war economies and industries, and obviously the demand for accountability to the peoples and justice rooted in their contexts. All our speakers will be touching on the structural analysis on imperialism and militarism, and the very key issues of the military-industrial complex, the extraction of resources, and accountability to the peoples today, to really highlight what are the grassroots demands for feminist peace and justice. So without further ado, I'll go on and introduce our speakers. We first have Jom Salvador. She's the regional coordinator of APWLD. Joms will help us set the tone for the webinar and share briefly on APWLD's feminist stance on imperialism and militarism. After Joms, we'll have Dr. Azra Tilat Saeed. Azra wears multiple hats. She's the executive director of Roots for Equity and is also the regional council member of APWLD. She works with the farmers in Pakistan and with a lot of mass organizations and also challenging the neoliberal policies. She's also a part of a lot of regional and global organizations such as the Asia Pacific Research Network, International Women's Alliance, International League for People's Struggles. Azra will help us lay down the foundational analysis, really highlighting that it is the imperialism which is at the core of militarism and wars in our region and globally. Moving on, we also have Xiao Liang, who's joining us from Sweden, Stockholm. He's a researcher on arms production and expenditure at the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute, which is SIPRI. His research areas cover the opportunity cost and reduction of military spending, relationship between military spending and development finance, and regional trends in the Asia Pacific. He's actually really a perfect person to help us unpack the data and numbers, and which really evidence who really perpetuates militarism and who benefits from it. After Shia, we'll have Nick Monica Flores, who's a queer indigenous Chamorro artist and organizer from Guahan, and also the director for Protehi Guahan. She will share us with the view from the ground and really help us understand how the military industrial complex looks and feels like for the people and community, especially the indigenous peoples within Guahan and Northern Mariana Islands, and how there is how the militarism is leading to an extreme destruction of the indigenous resources, especially through efforts like the deep sea mining. And last but not the least, we have Sarla Emmanuel. She's the feminist. She's a feminist activist and researcher. She's based in Batticaloa, which is the eastern coast of Sri Lanka, a region which has been a witness to civil war. And she will really share us with how the feminist movements look like in context of militarism and what are the demands of feminist peace and justice from the ground. So really, I now would like to hand over the floor to Joms. Joms, you may go ahead. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kamachi. And thank you, everyone. Warm greetings of solidarity to everyone here today. And thank you for joining us in this critical conversation at the moment when the Asia Pacific region, and indeed the world, is being reshaped by escalating wars, repression, and deepening inequalities. So we meet at a time when the world literally feels like it's burning, not only with bombs and bullets, but with the slow grinding violence of hunger, debt, land loss, and the tightening grip of authoritarianism. And so for us, the critical task today is to unpack what we see as one of the most enduring root causes of violence and injustice in our region, and that is imperialism and its mutually reinforcing relationship with militarism. Across Asia and the Pacific, the fight for justice and dignity has always been a story written against the grain of empire. Our region carries the deep imprints of colonial rule. Its borders were carved without our consent, its wealth extracted, its people disciplined through the violence of occupation, militarization, and debt. But these are not just histories. They are the living architecture of today's world order. So for us, imperialism is not a metaphor. It is a structure that decides who eats and who starves, who lives and who is left to die, which nations are armed and which nations are sanctioned, whose land is sacrificed for profit, and whose bodies bear the brunt of violence. It shapes our political systems, our economies, our food, our labor, and our daily survival. And today, the machinery of imperial dominance is tightening even more. We see it everywhere. We see it in Palestine, where militarized occupation and genocide unfolds in real time, funded, armed, and diplomatically shielded by global powers who speak the language of human rights while enabling the mass killing, displacement, and starvation of an entire people. We see it in Burma, Myanmar, where the junta wages war against its own citizens, backed by foreign arms, foreign capital, and geopolitical interests that value influence more than human life. We see it in the Philippines, where counterinsurgency programs, red tagging, and foreign military presence deepen repression, silence dissent, and militarize everyday life. We see it all across the Asia Pacific, where communities resisting mining, plantations, mega dams, and free trade agreements face militarized violence funded and enabled by global capital. So imperialism structures all of these crises. And it is not only about who controls land, it is about who controls economies, debt, technology, food systems, and political narratives. Colonial legacies continue to shape global hierarchies that deny local sovereignty over resources, labor, and markets. Meanwhile, militarism legitimizes violence in the name of security and defense, even as states expand surveillance, police powers, and military budgets, often at the expense of social services and people's survival needs. Imperialism as a whole continues to remake our region through a war economy driven by arms trade, military aid, military exercises, debt accumulation, and the violent extraction of resources. It is a political and economic model that prioritizes profit over human security, and it tightens the control of corporate and geopolitical actors over our lands, our bodies, and our futures. It is a model and a world order that actively thrives on conflict and instability. It pushes entire communities, especially women, peasants, indigenous peoples, migrants, and workers, deeper into debt, precarity, and displacement. So over the past 3 years, APWLB has convened dialogues, consultations, and collective analysis led by our members and grassroots women across the region. Together, we have traced how militarism is not an isolated crisis. It is the enforcement arm of imperialism. It is the weapon that upholds the extractive economy. It is the guardrail of global hierarchies built on colonial legacies. When people demand land, food, justice, or self-determination, militarism is deployed to discipline them. And yet, we also learned that grassroots women and peoples continue to resist. The struggle for a world without imperialism is undoubtedly long, but it is already unfolding. In the courage of women resisting junta rule in Myanmar, in the steadfastness of Palestinian women fighting for liberation, in indigenous communities blocking mines and plantations, in workers organizing across borders, in the young people who refuse to inherit a world built on domination. These struggles echo across our movements. They remind us that feminist peace is not the absence of conflict, but it is the presence of justice. It is the dismantling of all structures, economic, political, and military, that are designed to keep people in fear and in silence. That is why for us, dismantling the military industrial complex is central to our vision of feminist peace and justice. And grassroots women demand the removal of all foreign military bases from Asia and the Pacific, the end to military exercises, war games, and weapons testing, the stopping of weapons production and arms trade, the defunding of military expenditure, and the redirection of resources towards health, education, care, and social justice. No extraction of resources for the war economy, and affirming people's sovereignty over land, labor, and markets. We also demand reparations, accountability, and justice for communities devastated by militarization and war. So for us, these demands are not abstract because they reflect the realities and visions of communities who have endured militarized neo-colonial systems for generations and who continue to resist with courage, creativity, and collective power. They rise from women whose lands have been taken, whose families have been displaced, whose movements have been surveilled, whose voices have been criminalized. They come from women who carry the double burden of surviving militarism and imagining alternatives. So today's webinar is part of trying to build that alternative. And together, we hope to unpack the historical and structural links between imperialism and militarism. We will look at how the war economy has been normalized and how it drains public wealth away from care, social protection, and community well being. We will hear from grassroots movements who are not only resisting militarized and neo-colonial systems, but also constructing life-affirming, feminist, and people-centered alternatives. And so as we begin this conversation, if I may, I would like us to think beyond surface level reforms. Because if we want to achieve feminist peace and justice, we cannot simply soften the edges of violence. We must dismantle the imperial structures that create, justify, and sustain that violence. We must imagine and fight for a world where security is defined by the well being of peoples and the planet and not by military might. A world where resources nourish life instead of fueling war. A world where women, indigenous peoples, workers, and all marginalized communities can determine their own futures. And we hope that this webinar is a step towards that direction, to bring our movements together in order to deepen our shared analysis, to learn from grassroots struggles, and to build the regional solidarity that this moment demands. Because a world without imperialism is not a dream. It is for us and to many women of Asia Pacific region a burning necessity. It is a future being built right now by people who refuse to accept war, occupation, extraction, and inequality as the price of global order. So once again, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for being part of this collective journey for a world without imperialism and a future built on feminist peace and justice.
Thanks so much, Jones, for setting the tone of our webinar and to really, really highlight how a future without imperialism is a future that the women from the grassroots and women across the Asia Pacific region demand. And a world without militarism cannot be possible without dismantling the structural operations of imperialism, neocolonialism, and neoliberalism. May I now request Azra to go ahead and share her presentation. Azra is from Pakistan, and she's going to share the structural analysis on how militarism and imperialism are really, really deeply interconnected and intertwined with each other. Azra, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kamakshi. Thank you, Joms. That was a very powerful start to the webinar. And yes, entirely, the question is no more of maintaining status quo or accepting liberalism, accepting a softer face of capitalism. We are now in a real struggle to develop a system which is beyond capitalism and looks towards a system which is more based on justice, lasting peace, free of hunger, free of climate crises, and the list goes on. So I will start from basically trying to understand the geopolitical span of imperialism. And before getting into the main crux of the presentation, would really like to just first of all talk about what is imperialism. A very capitalist, a very liberal institution, Britannica, also thinks that imperialism is a state policy or a practice of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining political and economic control of other areas. Can you folks hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, there was a sense that people couldn't hear me. Okay.
We can hear you, Azra.
Okay. Apologies, huh? So, first of all, before I do anything else, I would really like to just talk about the definition of imperialism. And as I just said, it is direct power, dominion, and direct territorial acquisition and control. Now, if we look at a more left Marxist orientation, Lenin had defined it by different stages of imperialism. And I will kind of skip the first two and then just look at what is happening right now with respect to domination of finance capital and financial oligarchy, and then the colonial conquest that Joms also talked about, and which we watch live on our TVs every day, the killings of people, of children, the starving kids who are trying to just find a meager drop of water, walking miles without shoes. So to the people who are living on this planet at this point, from my generation to young children, uh, imperialism is now very stark. It is a daily occurrence of our lives. And we really need to think in terms of who are the people who are responsible. So, based on latest data, we see that the top five military spenders are USA, China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia. And if you look at the figures, all of them together, from China to Saudi Arabia, actually still do not spend as much as what the United States spends on their military, about $900 billion approximately. And then China's is like maybe one third of what Americans are spending, and Russia and the rest of them much lesser in numbers. I think for us to understand what militarism is really what imperialism is all about. Militarism. There are two tools, there's the economic power, and then there is um, uh, uh, the military power. And of course, both of them are critical, especially to the countries who are neo-colonial and um, have to have to deal with not only the military strength of countries like the United States, but also their financial institutions. And I will talk about it in a minute. Just to look at the United States military strength, they have what they call geographic commands. And there are like one, two, three, four, five different areas which they define as their areas of responsibility. I'm not sure who told them that our countries, our lands are their areas of responsibility, but they have what they we call the US CENTCOM, based in Stuttgart, Germany. Then we have the CENTCOM, which is based directly in the United States, and it controls areas around the Middle East and Central Asia. And then Eurocom, which is again in Stuttgart, Germany. Northcom is again in the United States itself, in Colorado, one of their states, I think. And then Southcom is the southern region. It is based in Florida, and Southcom is very much in the picture in these days, with the Americans getting ready to attack Venezuela. So then if you look at the bases, there are different figures if we look at it, but generally it is accepted that the United States has more than 750 bases in at least 80 countries around the world, and it has more than almost 200,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. Their bases are basically considered to be of two types: large bases, which are present on more than 4 hectares of land, which is about 10 acres of land. And with these bases generally have more than 200 troops on the ground. And the military worth of these bases is more than $10 million USD dollars. 60% of the American bases are known as to be large bases, which is about more than 400 bases that they have worldwide are then considered large bases. The smaller bases are called lily pads, which are anything but lily pads. And that's a very sick word for something which is so notoriously destructive, and it's a killer, no? To call it lily pads is really in itself a very sick presentation of what the reality is. 40% of the bases are then based on less than 4 hectares of land, and they are worth less than 10 million acres of land. I have not talked about the military industrial complex, but the United States has the world's biggest military industrial complex, which means that there is a shift of military personnel to the government structures, the bureaucracy in the United States, and there is a revolving door from the corporations, the industrial weapons industry, which is the biggest in the world. With last I remember was that of the 25 biggest corporations, 12 are from the United States. And their revenues is also, meaning their profits, profits of killing people, of genocide, is also extremely high in comparison to other countries. Because I want to talk about militarism, I would really like to just have a quick look at this graph that I've been using for some years now. And this gives us data on who are the biggest countries in terms of oil. And down the list, we have Venezuela as the top, then Saudi Arabia, Canada, and so on and so forth. So the countries in orange are the countries which the United States has already attacked and basically taken control of the bureaucracy, of the government running, of the policy framework in these countries, which includes Iraq, Kuwait, and Libya. And then the yellow are the countries which are complicit in genocide, along with the United States, and Saudi Arabia, Canada, and UAE stand very tall in this order. It's a very, these countries have shown very clearly in the genocide that is happening in Palestine that their role is very, very almost shoulder to shoulder with the United States in ensuring that the US has control over oil in these countries. And then finally, we have the yellow countries, the pink countries, which are sanctioned countries. And sanctions is also a highly used imperialist tool by the United States to control countries which are not willing to agree to the policy framework or of monopoly capital of United States. So going from a general idea of where, because minerals, which includes oil, but also includes rare earth metals, also includes critical metals, I will get into it in a bit, are what the any monopoly capitalist will require, because to build, to especially weapons, the weapons industry is highly dependent on critical minerals. And oil, of course, runs everything under capitalism, from their industries to their very privileged, decadent lifestyles, to the trade routes, of course, the trade for commodities and goods and goods especially. So we see that around Venezuela, in the very just few weeks, the military presence of the United States has increased immensely. First of all, they are increasing the capacity of their military sites in their territories, especially Puerto Rico, and then in the US Virgin Islands. And uh, uh, numerous aircrafts have been seen in that area and around the Caribbean and Venezuela, and they seem to be all preparing for war. A large number of ships have been deployed. 8 of them, I did not put them up here in the list, but 8 of them have been now deployed, and the map shows them. It's too small for you folks to see it, but they're deployed around Venezuela. And the context at the point is, at this moment, is that they are going there to control drugs. There are drug cartels. And is that how you control drug cartels? Is by coming and killing people who are on boats unidentified. And so what happened to diplomacy? What happened to discussion? All of that is gone. And so it's really a facade to talk about drug cartels in the Caribbean and in the Latin American continent. It's very clearly understood that it is about oil, as it was in Iraq. Later on, they said it was not about mass weapons. It was all about oil. I would like to bring your attention to a particular imperialist tool that the Americans have been using in the past 5 years. It's called the Abraham Accords. And I bring it up mainly to show that how UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, Morocco, and others have been complicit in what is happening around the world, especially in the WANA region, in the West Asia, North America region, with the attacks on not only occupied Palestine, but Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and the conflict is now also spreading to other parts of the world. So I will not really get into the Abraham Accords. I just wanted to show you that such accords, so-called peace accords, are really based on the definition of peace of imperialist countries, especially the United States. So in order to ensure that the Middle East is in their hands, they started talking about Abraham Accords. And one of the countries they forced to agree to the accord was Sudan, which was in 2020 during the time we had COVID. And so what is Sudan? Sudan is the third largest coal producer in the region. And the specifically the United Arab Emirates has been responsible for much of the genocide. There is a genocide in Sudan. I specifically brought up Sudan today because we are all highlighting what is happening in Palestine. Our constant attention is on Palestine. But at the same time, there is also a genocide happening in Sudan, with more than 150,000 people have already been killed. 15 million people have been displaced going onto the border region countries, and 25 million are facing extreme humanitarian crisis. What is the geopolitical importance of Sudan? It has a very vast coastline on the Red Sea, and the Red Sea is the very the sea which connects to the Suez Canal, and it is a critical strategic trade route and a military route for maintaining control in the Asia Pacific region, but specifically for the Middle East. And so we see that although the Americans have not shown their face at all, but the weapons that are being used by the United Arab Emirates are largely coming from the US. From 2015 to 2025, UAE was the 10th largest arms importer. And who was providing these weapons to UAE? 55% was coming from France, and another 14% was coming from, sorry, 55% was coming from the United States, and another 14% was coming from France. So we can see that not only the imperialists are on the forefront of war, but their client states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are also very, very complicit in what is happening in Sudan. So now the US is talking about, a peace accord, and the USA Quad policy, which is a combination of UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, as well as the United States, trying to get peace in Sudan. But let us not forget that some years ago, they also divided the country from Sudan into South Sudan. And South Sudan has about 3.5 million barrels of oil. And China has been very, very active in the region. It has also been building not the number of bases that the Americans have, but China has one single base in this area in Djibouti. And so we can see that this jostling of imperialism is between numerous countries, which includes China, Russia, and the US. But Russia and China, in context to the US, are really small players. Russia recently has been granted a naval facility in the Sudan region, at the Sudan port. So this is just another glimpse from Venezuela to Sudan of what is happening in the country, in the world, actually, sorry.
We have 2 more minutes.
Okay, so I will go very quickly. And the last, this is something which is also very critical, that NATO last year, just in this month, December, brought out a defense critical minerals list, which it said was critical for its weapons industry. And the weapons industry, in small print, you can see the submarines, the airplanes, other forms of small arms, all of this, NATO, which is a coalition of 32 countries from the Atlantic Ocean and the United States and Canada, and along with the US Army, which you already saw, are the basic tools, no? Are the basic faces of militarism, which we suffer from, which John so well put in the beginning. I wanted to bring one more thing to the table, and that is the SWIFT um, system through which we all send money. It is supposed to be just a method for transferring money, but in essence, it is it is a weaponized instrument. Why? Because all sanctions are enforced by the United States through the SWIFT system. It is for economic transactions, and most of the money flow is for international trade and finances are conducted in US dollars using the SWIFT system for transfer of money. So most of the high value transactions are cleared through US financial institutions or banks, and the US can effectively cut off sanctioned entities from large portions of the global financial system. It is also a tool of coercion. Anybody who dares to interact with countries who are under US sanction are then also threatened with various forms of retributions coming from the United States. Those were the military tools, but now I also wanted to highlight, because we are talking about financial monopoly at the higher stage of imperialism, and one is SWIFT. Then we also have other very, very coercive agreements, such as the investor state dispute settlement. I don't need to talk about IMF and World Bank, but IMF and World Bank are responsible for creating situations where governments have to accept the Abraham Accords, and that was the case with Sudan. Similarly, in Pakistan, high debt right now, and we see that the Pakistani army is being twisted to not only, hopefully not, but we are very afraid that it is all about Abraham Accords. At the same time, they demonize us, making sure that people's resistance is totally subdued because of this. I'll end with this. This was an American, a director of policy planning in the United States. He said that the United States had 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3 of the world's population. Therefore, the real task, according to him, for the years to come was for the United States to find ways to hold on to this position of disparity. So very clearly, it was shown that it was very clearly projected by the Americans that if they wanted to be monopoly capitalist, they needed to maintain that kind of military strength. This cake is a cake that was celebrated by the US Navy a year after the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, in which 260,000 people had died. But of course, the Americans have literally no shame about what they have done to the world. And they were gleeful enough to have a cake in the shape of a mushroom. For us, what is the fight back? This is the time that we really need to build anti-imperialist, anti-fascist political education across our communities, talk about religious and sectoral and gender ethnic divides that the fascists are doing deliberately, so that we keep on fighting among ourselves. What is happening in Sudan is a clear case of religious genocide, fueled by the people themselves and fueled by these regional forces who have an interest in controlling the gold which is present in Sudan. It is up to us to accelerate a class-based political education system, to understand that the imperialists are only 1% of the world's population. It is up to us to stand up and unite among ourselves across all sectors, across gender, across religious divides, to come back and fight back the imperialist system. We really need to go in every direction possible so that we would have just and lasting peace. Thank you very much for giving me the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azra, for really exposing the facade behind everything termed as national security, or war on drugs or war on terror. But the real face of imperialism and militarism is for us to see, and how it's perpetuating within the Asia Pacific and also globally. I would now invite Xiao from CIPRI to really share with us, how the trends look like for the Asia Pacific, because these numbers are not just numbers, because they also are really an evidence of what we are going through and how much of a priority our lives or the climate crisis or gender equality is for the imperial nations and even our countries. Go ahead, Xiao, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kamakshi, and thank you, Asra, for your very amazing presentation. And so my hope, hopefully my contribution today is to, as Kamakshi said, provide some evidence and laying the ground for all these trends in our world, like the rising trends of militarism, because at CIPRI, what we do is to publish data on global trends in military spending, in arms sales, and in the arms revenues of the military industrial complex. So I'm going to go through each of these elements and hopefully provide some more data and evidence that all of you can use in your day-to-day activism. So basically, I will cover three areas. The first is military spending. So, who are the biggest militaries in the world? How much money is spent into weapons every year? And then arms transfers, which is who are buying and selling the weapons. And lastly, who is benefiting from all these trends? So, the arms industry, the arms companies. And lastly, I will give a few points on some research areas where we say Asia Pacific is specifically being affected by all these trends. So first, in terms of military spending, um, just to provide an update on the data that Azra showed. So last year, 2024, global military expenditure rose to 2.7 trillion US dollars, uh, which means it increased every year for a full decade. And it was like 37% higher than it was in 2015. So the 9.4% increase last year was also the steepest increase since 1988, since the end of the Cold War. This really speaks to the magnitude of the rising militarism in our world. And just to give you an idea of this number, I know like 2.7 trillion sounds a lot, so it was 2.5% of the world's GDP. And on average, if you divide it by every person in the world, that's about 334 US dollars per person in our world. So as you could see, like the trend here, we had a brief period of decrease after the end of the Cold War, which is what a lot of people call the peace dividend period. But then since around 2001, the war on terror from the US, the global military spending started rising again, especially as you can see from the United States. And then there was another brief period of decline after the global financial crisis and all the austerity measures. But then it started rising again around 2014 since the recent tensions in between Russia and Europe, and the trend really accelerated after 2022 because of wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, and tensions in the rest of the world. So just
Sorry
to,
for
yes.
interrupting. We cannot see your screen. Are you
Oh,
sharing?
I'm really sorry. Uh,
No worries.
Let me. Yes.
Yes, you can see it now.
Great. Yeah, so this was just the trend I talked about as just to see how steep the rise is, and then um, the, going to different regions in the world. So military spending also increased in all of the five world's regions, which really reflects the heightened geopolitical tensions and wars and conflicts across the world. And so this was especially obvious in Europe, which had an almost 20% increase, largely driven by the war in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, which also had a huge increase driven by the war in Gaza and other regional conflicts. But as you can see, the biggest spenders a region is still the Americas, which is mostly, so almost 1 trillion out of this 1.1 trillion are spent by the US. And then in our region in Asia, it is also one of the biggest spenders in terms of the region because of big spenders like China, India, Japan, South Korea. So if we dive a bit more into the biggest spenders, so the world's two biggest spenders are US and China, which together accounted for almost half of the global spending. But as you can see, US with almost $1 trillion is really the biggest driver. And also, I guess this I'm trying to show in this figure is how the biggest spenders, like top 10, top 15, are really driving the global trends. So any changes by these biggest militaries will have a huge effect on the finance in the whole world. So the top, for example, all the top 10 spenders here account for more than 70% of global spending. And they include, of course, US, China, but also other major European countries, as well as like the P5 members of the UN. So then just looking specifically into Asian Pacific, we can see China is the biggest spender, which has been increasing its military consecutively for the last 30 years, driven by this modernization plan of the Chinese army. But all its neighbors are also increasing a lot, especially for example Japan, which has recently abandoned its so-called pacifist defense policy to pursue like a very active military strategy, has been ramping up its spending a lot. And then three of the world's top 10 spenders are in our region. They are China, Japan, and India, which is the fifth largest spender. And then, as you can see here, Myanmar, which is not a big spender, but its spending increased by 66%, which is the highest in the world last year, I think, in terms of increase, obviously due to the ongoing war and actions by the military junta. So as you can see, although there has been less like big conflicts or wars in Asia Pacific, but the rising trend of the mounting spending on the military in Asia has been pretty similar with the global trends like in Europe or the Middle East. And then moving on to arms transfers, which is the amount of weapons that are being exported and imported. So again, looking at the biggest exporters, which are the countries selling weapons. Again, it's all these biggest military spenders, the biggest militaries in our world, US being the top, which account for over 40% of all the weapons sold in our world. Um, and then this is followed by France, Russia, and China. And France was not like the second in the previous period, but it really benefited from like selling weapons to Ukraine, but also India, which is its biggest spender. So it's also become a more important player in our region. And Russia's export has been falling in recent years, but not because it's producing less weapons, but most of them have been used to supply its own war, so it's selling less to other countries. But then you see the other biggest exporters are also exactly the countries we showed in a previous slide, like Germany, China, Italy, the UK, and Israel, which are also some of the biggest exporters in the world. And then on the flip side, so which are the countries buying all these weapons? So the top five arms importers are Ukraine, India, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Ukraine, obviously, due to the war, but then India and Pakistan, which are also some of the biggest importers of arms, which are in Asia due to like it's the conflicts between the two countries. And then just to highlight the problem, so in terms of regions, so our region in the, Asia and Oceania, despite all the increases in Europe, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, we are still the biggest importers or buyers of arms in the world as a whole region. Although this share decreased a little bit in the last 5 years, but as you can see, it is still more than what Europe or like Ukraine or Middle East is buying. So looking to the specific countries, so four of the world's 10 largest arms importers are in Asia. So India, Pakistan, Japan, Australia. And as you can see here, like it's a breakdown by the countries supplying them the weapons. So it's really, as you can see here, it's really highlights the effect of military alliances. So for example, for Japan, Australia, South Korea, and also Taiwan, they buy almost all their weapons from the US. And then for Pakistan and Thailand, they get most of the weapons from China. And then in the case of India, it's more balanced. So they're buying like some from France, some from Russia, and some from the US. But as you can see, this really shows how countries and powers outside of Asia are involved in supplying weapons to the Asia Pacific. So lastly, but not the least, I want to present like the latest data, which was also just published this Monday from CIPRI on the world's top 100 arms companies in our world. So basically, the military industrial complex were producing all these weapons. So last year, all the arms revenues from all the top 100 arms companies rose by about 6%, and to reach 679 billion US dollars, which is the highest on record. And this was largely driven again by the war in Gaza, in Ukraine, and global tensions where countries are all arming themselves and buying more weapons. And as you can see, in the top 20, so four of the top five companies here are from the US. So you see some familiar names like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, and then also 9 out of the top 20 are from the US, and 4 are from China, and 1 from Russia and other European countries. Again, you see, you probably thought that this is the exact same figure that I showed you before, but it is not. But again, it's um, same the similar set of countries in terms of arms revenue, in terms of their industry size. So the US alone accounts for almost half of the world global revenue, and then followed by China, UK, and Russia. But those even added together are much smaller than the US. And this also just shows you how the war profiteering is going well for all the companies in the world. So as you can see, almost all countries increased their revenue from arms industry last year. At the top, Japan, Germany, and South Korea, which are really benefiting a lot from the recent drive for arms procurement from all countries. And the only decrease here is China, but it's just a coincidence. I think it's just a temporary trend because now they've been recently been cracking on corruption in their military. So a lot of contracts are being affected. But given the investment by China in its military, will probably go back to increase again soon. So last year, over 70 of the top 100 companies increased their revenue, and so even you can see that in income, even if you don't follow all these revenue figures, you probably heard a lot about the stocks of these companies rising from the US, from Europe. So that really shows you how much profit they're gaining from the ongoing militarization. And just very briefly, so just to visualize, this is what I showed you already, but just the location of the top 100 companies in the world. So again, 40 of them are from the US, which is the largest share, and about a quarter, 26, is from Europe, and which is the second biggest area in terms of arms industry. And then and then there's 9 from Middle East, 3 from Israel, 5 from Turkey, and also 1 from the UAE. And then in our region, there are 23 in the top 100. As you can see, China is the biggest, but also Japan, South Korea, India, Singapore also rising fast. And just I don't know, I know I don't have too much time, but just some implications from the research side that we found for Asia Pacific, because I know all of you are probably much more an expert on how this is affecting people's lives on the ground on a daily basis. But just to show you, because I know I gave you a lot of numbers, which might be very confusing, just to show you a magnitude of how big global military spending is. So as you can see, the 2.7 trillion last year, in comparison, really makes other spending priorities in our world look so small. For example, the total official development assistance (ODA) by all the OECD countries last year was less than 10% of global military spending, and also compared to all the other global spending gap on important SDG areas like health, education, climate adaptation, even a fraction of this big red circle can really fill the gap of all the spending needs of sustainable development. So and we also found in research what is especially important for Asia Pacific is so this increase doesn't affect every country equally. So actually usually affects the poor countries or regions disproportionately. So really enhances inequality in our world, because usually you see countries diverting spending from health, education, and social protection into their defense budgets, and this really affects how wealth is distributed. And usually the poorest countries and household and also women are being affected most by the cut in, for example, in healthcare, in childcare, and all these social areas. And also, as I just showed you, in terms of the geopolitical national dimension, when when countries in Asia are like spending all this money, a lot of this actually goes into buying weapons from the even richer or bigger powers like US and France. So this is again like like a regressive distribution that transfers wealth from the poorer countries to the richer countries. And also, we've seen that this rising military trend really affects like democracy and accountability because usually, as you probably know, the defense budget is the most secret and the most superior part in a national budget and usually receives the least amount of scrutiny and oversight from the civil society. For example, we can see this in Japan, in Myanmar, where the government can just increase spending as they want for national security reasons. And also, we see like countries with higher or stronger military usually has lower democratic weaker democratic institutions, and such as like in the Philippines or in Thailand. And last but not the least, there's also huge impact ignored usually in defense budget debate is the environmental cost of war and militarization. So we've seen that all the military in the world at least account for 7 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions as a like underestimate. But these are usually not excluded in national carbon reporting. For example, all the countries like reporting obligations under COP, under Paris Agreement, they do not include like reporting on their emissions from the militaries, which is so this is really an overlooked area that I think is worth looking more into. But these are only some of the few areas that in research on the impacts of military spending. But I'm really looking forward to listening to more experiences on the ground from the panel today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Shah, for laying out, those numbers and statistics, and especially showing them in a graphic manner so that it's easier, we hope, for our participants to understand the magnitude of militarism that we are facing today, and obviously driven by the United States of America at the helm, with about $1 trillion in military spending, which is more than any of the other 9 countries could match up, cumulatively. And really, Azra also showed how that is building a huge military infrastructure, especially within the Asia Pacific, to counter the so-called threat of China. We'll now move on to listen to some voices from the ground. We have Nick with us from Guam, who can really share the stories from the ground and what militarization will really look like for the communities, the indigenous communities and women on the ground. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Kamakshi and EPWLD for putting this webinar together. Half a day. It's actually Managapopongi, or good evening from Guam or Guahan. Guam and the Northern Marianas and Puerto Rico that was mentioned earlier, we're like in this weird ambivalent state as military colonies, as unincorporated territories of the United States. And we have a lot going on in the Indo-Pacific, and at the same time, in the Caribbean, there's a massive military expansion happening as the U.S. prepares to enter into war with Venezuela. And so we really should think about Puerto Rico right now, and Vieques, who successfully removed the Navy from the island in the early 2000s. It's heartbreaking and devastating to imagine that now the United States is entering their waters, skies, and lands once again against the consent and will of the people. And again, we are occupied military colonies of the United States. We have limited representation. We don't have full protection of the Constitution. We don't have a voting representative in Congress. We don't have a vote for the president. Not that some of us would want that kind of annexation or a vote for colonial president. A lot of us, myself included, many of us want full liberation, independence from the empire, the United States empire. And so it's an honor to be here with you all today. I'm going to get into my slides real quick. Let's see. Sorry. Yes, so, oops. So this is our Instagram. Please follow us on Instagram. You'll get our most up-to-date information on our Instagram. We're also on Facebook. But, just to get into it, there are long-standing systemic issues and vulnerabilities that exist in all of these areas that are impacted by U.S. bases that we've, and U.S. militarization that we've already sort of heard in the presentation. We're also in the midst of a real climate crisis. These are some of the true security issues for us, right? The issues that create conflict and real security risks. We're seeing tons of floods, tons of devastating storms happening throughout the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, we're seeing this massive military buildup, this expansion of U.S. Military occupation in the region, the military being the world's worst polluter and the largest consumer of fossil fuels, exacerbating the climate crisis with their war games, with their buildup, with the wars and the genocide, and at the same time making our region more vulnerable to these storms that just grow bigger and more devastating. I think of, our comrades in the Philippines, in Vietnam, and Indonesia, literally nonstop storms, and even in Thailand, flooding. These things are exacerbated by the military industrial complex. And of course, the issue of poverty and what we're seeing right now, the US interventions triggering instability. And all of this is for political and economic competition and, geopolitical competition in the region. And so a lot of these problems are also rooted in our colonial or territorial statuses. For us, as colonies, we, like I mentioned, we're not fully incorporated. We have limited ways of making an impact, and the decisions that are made about our island, decisions that are made without our consent. And so, other than Guam or Guahan, which was separated from the islands north of us after the Spanish-American War with the Treaty of Paris, the United States took Guam to be for its strategic location. And, during the Spanish colonization and during the U.S. colonization, Guam has always been an important location for transit for the military. And so, we see this also with other coercive and restrictive agreements throughout the Indo-Pacific, mutual defense treaties, status of forces agreement. These are not agreements between two equally powered sovereign nations. These are often coercive, a very extractive and exploitive agreements that allow the United States to occupy air, land, and sea at any time through military activities. And so we really see that with the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands under the Compacts of Free Association, which derive from the Trust Territories of the Pacific after World War II. But we also have a long history of violent crimes, war crimes, and a history of military sexual violence throughout the region that has never been dealt with since World War II, with, the expansive Japanese empire throughout the Pacific and in Asia. We saw the subjugation of women and girls, the trafficking of women from all over. This has never been accounted for. Justice has never really hasn't been achieved for a lot of those women, and that phenomenon has actually metamorphosized into issues of also camp town women and other forms of sexual exploitation around military bases and around military exercises, military installations, whether they're permanent or short term. And so we also see that connected to the phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women in North America, where in areas where exploitation and mineral extraction is taking place, again, for the weapons industry. It's linked to that phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirits, and men, just this phenomenon of racist murder. And of course, we have a lot of us share a long history of environmental degradation and contamination, which I'll get into. None of these issues have been resolved with a great deal of accountability and transparency from the United States. In fact, there's a significant issue of underreporting and a lack of transparency. At the same time, we are burdened with nonstop war games and different comment periods for destructive military activities that are sometimes in violation of either US law or international law. Where we all share histories and current issues of water contamination, land taking and land occupation, displacement that comes from that. And This, of course, causing a housing crisis, a healthcare crisis, food and water security crisis. This is something that we share from Puerto Rico to Hawaii, to the Philippines, to Okinawa, to Guam, to anywhere the United States has a base. And as was mentioned earlier, the United States is the country with the most foreign bases overseas. And as was mentioned earlier, we're seeing a depression of dissent against the right wing regime that we're seeing in the West right now in the United States, and it's supporting countries in Israel. Of course, with the suppression of dissent and the rise in violence against migrant communities and immigrant communities, the racialized violence of that, the violence against trans, Two-Spirit, and indigenous communities, we're also seeing this pushback against any efforts for decolonization and also for climate justice. And so we're also seeing constant violations of our rights to free, prior, and informed consent. And just to give you this is just a snapshot here. In Guam, this is according to the census in 2020, we have a population of almost 154,000. But in addition to that, another 21,700 military members and their dependents. And that's expected to double in the coming years as we see the relocation of Marines from Okinawa to Guam. Of course, that resulting from many years of resistance to the military sexual violence and the environmental destruction that has happened in Okinawa. A lot of what we share, Guam earlier this year had a water crisis, a deodorant contamination crisis, and we see deodorant in these same places: Hawaii, Okinawa, the Philippines, Korea. Sorry.
Your presentation, we cannot see it in the presenter mode. Can you move the slides?
Sorry, you can't see it at all?
We can see it, but I think the slides are not moving.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Let me try again. I see. Hold on just a second. Oh man. Sorry. So sorry, everybody. Hopefully this will do it. I see what you're saying. So, oh, nope, that's not the one. Sorry. Okay. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, here we go. Okay. Do you
yes, we can see it now.
see it now? Okay, great. And so I left off with Guam having a crisis of deodorant contamination earlier this year. It affected our village with the highest population, but also the claims were that we don't know where the source of this contamination is. And this village, this area, the well that's directly impacted is right outside the Air Force Base gate. Of course, we share Agent Orange, PFAS, and PFOA contamination lead. A lot of us have history of oil spills, unexploded ordnance, and negligent hazardous waste disposal. And of course, in the Marshall Islands, nuclear radiation contamination fallout from tests. The fallout from tests reached Guam, the Northern Marianas, Palau. And so there's a long history of military contamination and exposure that we're fighting against. And unfortunately, the agreements that these are sovereign countries in the Pacific and also here in the territories, these agreements give the United States very, very much authority to do whatever they want. They basically have a lot of limitations that prevent us from seeing justice. It gives them a lack of legal obligation. And so, for instance, their own law prevents them from removing their hazardous waste that they store in the Marshall Islands that they put there. And of course, we have these joint military training exercises. These images on the right are from RE4PAC, which happened earlier this year here in Guam, which are a part of the Talisman Sabre exercises from Australia through Papua New Guinea. But these are just some of the many exercises that we share, and we often see a lot of the military training together with the United States, the Australian military, the Japan military, self-defense forces, Korea, Singapore, and the Philippines. And so this is something that we all experience as well. This is a map I always show. The United States is all the way up here, and it's almost like this is a net that it casts throughout the Pacific and Asia, setting up these stages for war, for sites for U.S. force projection. They use a lot of rhetoric like the mainland, the homeland, that we're all somehow part of the U.S. homeland. This is not our mainland. This is not our homeland. And we should not be set up as the stomping grounds or collateral damage for the United States to defend itself, defend the homeland, or defend the mainland, when in essence, they're making us larger targets for conflict in hosting their bases and their war games and exercises. And so in the third island chain, we have Hawaii, American Samoa, and New Zealand. We have Guam here in the second island chain with the Northern Marianas, Yap, and Palau. Australia's just kind of here in the middle. And then in the first island chain, we have Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Singapore. All of this, of course, is leading up to what they're framing as an inevitable conflict with China, ironically, to help defend the decolonization of Taiwan from China in violation of the one China policy, but ignoring its own colonies. And in fact, we can even argue that in some ways, these relationships of some of the even sovereign nations are colonial with the United States empire. This is a map of submarine stations, and again, you can see the island chains sort of laid out here. The yellow ones are rotating, the greens are temporary. There's one permanent base, this blue dot, which is in Guam. Guam is a permanent base for nuclear submarines of the United States. It's interesting to see that the United States also has subs, of course, in Hawaii, Australia, and in the countries in the first island chain. This is just a map of the missile defense system, which is being built here in the Guam flight test that took place last year. The first one is the first missile test. That missile testing was fast-tracked through any environmental impact assessments, which was quite shocking and devastating for us. It encroaches on several private properties, again, in violation of our free, prior, informed consent. But all of the companies that are part of this, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, they're all a part of this military buildup and all of this new infrastructure that's supposedly here to defend Guam, but it's not here to defend the citizens. There are no plans for bomb shelters or evacuation. These are all to protect U.S. military installations. This is the open burn and open detonation area. And then this is the divert airfield in Tinian. This is the runway where the two bombs that land on Hiroshima, the atomic bombs landed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki took off. And this is being built again to be a divert airfield for when Guam is devastated in an attack, for the United States to quickly relocate a lot of its collateral and military equipment here. The United States is also currently engaged in 5 harmful military buildup projects in Palau, in the sovereign nation of Palau. This is just one of them, the tactical mobile over the horizon radar. It's in violation of U.S. National Environmental Policy Act, as well as Palau conservation laws. Earlier this year, when the U.S. joined Israel in its unprovoked attack on Iran, Guam was used as a decoy. We woke up to reports that B-52s overnight were coming from Missouri on their way to Iran. And just hours later, Iran was bombed. Again, here we are seeing the United States march us into war with manufactured consent, just like the lies that brought manufactured public consent to support a war with Iraq, the lies of weapons of mass destruction. We're looking at the same lies that Iran is planning to build a nuclear weapon, and Guam is being swept up in this. The same time, we're overwhelmed with these comment periods. At the same time, we're overwhelmed with these war games. And at the same time, we're watching other territories, other colonies of the United States being built up for war as well. This is our connection to the genocide in Palestine. The destruction and devastation of our island for this military buildup is connected to the genocide in Palestine. These images are of drones and quadrocopters that are being tested in the CNMI joint military training. We protested the comment period for this earlier this summer. But this is continuous testing in the Northern Marianas Islands. And of course, these are weapons that are used to murder civilians in Palestine. The same language, the Iron Dome, is being used to justify the missile defense system here in Guam. It's being compared to the Iron Dome, and actually some of that tech was tested here in Guam. And so these same companies that are profiting from occupation and genocide are the same ones that are profiting with the military buildup and multiple military projects in Guam and in the Northern Marianas. And right now, the Trump administration has just announced the comment period for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is under the Department of Interior, announced a request for information last month in November 12th. And so comments are due December 12th. And we developed a toolkit. We're actually hosting a comment workshop next week. But this is part of the new arms race, because the United States, the Trump administration does not want to spend money in buying these rare earth materials for weapons and other tech from other countries, including China. And so the Trump administration has announced this immediate need to start pursuing deep sea mining in the Pacific and so they're looking at the Marianas, including the Northern Marianas and near Guam, off of the Marianas Trench, about 100 square miles. And we are, of course, opposing this. This is a part of a new wave of economic colonization and an attack on sovereignty throughout the Pacific. And so we also need to build resistance in other countries that are, racing for these leases for rare earth mineral mining from the deep sea, including Korea, China, Japan, all of these Australia, Canada, all these other countries that are looking at deep sea mining. And so what we really need to do is demand genuine security, not military security, not national security, but what does it really mean to have genuine security? We need to build solidarity to resist imperialism and the military industrial complex. We need to demand decontamination, remediation, removal of bases, and land return. We need to demand for justice for the history of military sexual violence and crimes of war. We need to fight for decolonization in occupied lands. We need to resist AUKUS and deep sea mining. And we must also resist the U.S. aggression with Venezuela and the buildup in the Caribbean. Fuera Yankee del Caribe. And it's an honor to stand in solidarity with all of you here. This was our protest when Pete Hegseth came to Guam. Yes, thank you so much. That concludes my presentation. I'll hand it over to Kamakshi for Q&A. Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much, Nick, for really zooming in into one of the crucial areas, the Pacific, which is in our region, and how the military buildup looks like there, and how it's really impacting the communities, taking up their lands, and now looking to extract more and more resources using the deep sea mining. And thanks also for sharing how it's geopolitically connected to other regions, and why we must stand in solidarity as people from the Asia Pacific together to really resist this imperialism. We now move on to last but not the least, our speaker Sarla Manuel. She's from Sri Lanka, and Sarla has really been there with building feminist peace and justice on the ground, and can share reflections of what true feminist peace and justice and real accountability should look like for the women, for the communities on the ground. Over to you, Sarla.
Thank you. And it's a real honor to be here with all of you. So my kind of contributions to today's webinar might be coming from a slightly different perspective, but I'm hoping it would add to the overall conversation and discussion today. As we meet today, my country, we are in the throes. I am me and other feminist activists, we are in the throes of relief efforts as my country is surviving the third cyclone storm to hit the island within 1 year. This time, close to 500 people have died and thousands are displaced due to Cyclone Ditwa, and livelihoods have been damaged, etc. The military and the Ministry of Defense are fully involved and leading the immediate disaster response. The lack of a trained and equipped civilian disaster response cadre, with the rolling back in investment in public sector, has meant dependence on the military at this time. While recognizing the efforts and humanitarian motives of all rescue efforts underway, in the future we need to move towards civilian systems. In this vein, I will focus on grassroots struggles that have challenged core structures that hold up the global military-industrial complex. Structures that make us fall back on these militarized systems during times of crisis. Structures I will focus on are structures of labor, sexuality, and the law. In our regional convening, APWLD regional convening this year, we discussed how the military-industrial complex runs on working class labor. I'm actually interested, I have a question for our fellow panelists from CIPRI, whether you have a map of where are all the factories and where does all the labor come from for the military-industrial complex. Not only are poor working class men from our regions fighting for imperial armies in the global north, including Russia, Israel, there are thousands of workers, women workers, working within the military-industrial complex in our own countries. As a regional feminist movement, in our convening, we identified the urgent need to strengthen connections among our workers to voice key demands against militarism. I want to share the voice of my colleague and prominent feminist trade unionist Menaha Kandasamy, who articulated this urgency with a call for global action to stop the war in Palestine. Kamakshi, you will help me to play the video?
Yes, I am sharing my screen. Sorry. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, just play the video now.
Right? Workers, we are not going to support for this. Workers in the world should not support for this cause. So without any powerful government support, guns, bombs, this won't happen. Let us think what we have to do now. How to stop this genocide. The workers are building guns, making bombs, loading, unloading. Workers are in factories, in warehouses. We have to bring them together. They are the solid supporters. Workers can bring the change to the world. We know, history taught us, we should not forget. We have to remember rich and powerful states and all missions will divide us. Well-planned division, they will divide us. We have to remember coming together, bringing workers together, going to end this war. Let us think about it. Let us work for this. Free Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamakshi. To continue in terms of the impact of militarism, I will share below a few snippets from movements in Sri Lanka. Movements that make the connection between militarism and other normative structures, such as sexuality, normative family, patriarchal ideas of community and the nation state that is made up, and all of these that makes up our nation state. So the first example, in 2016, a public submission was made by the LGBTQIA community and civil society groups, including feminist activists such as myself. We made a submission to the Consultations Task Force for Transitional Justice Mechanisms, which had been set up in the post-war context in Sri Lanka. The LGBTQIA plus community is criminalized in Sri Lanka under colonial laws which still continue. In this context, the submission highlighted how militarization created and boosted very stark models of masculinity and femininity and forced people into adopting extreme binary gender conforming roles. The submission read, I quote, "Militarization paves the way for these rigid gender norms to be connected to reproductive sexuality, where sexuality is confined to the logic of reproduction within marriage and the monogamous heteronormative family unit. Women are seen only in their roles as wives and mothers in the private domain, praised for being guardians of the home, for bringing up healthy, normal families on the patriarchal model, and for ensuring the continuity of their ethnic group and the nation." In one fell swoop, this statement showed how the normative family, purist ideas of ethnicity, and the nation state are stacked into one another structurally and need one another to remain intact. Removing one block from one of these structures threatens the entire structure to fall like dominoes, thus challenging normative ideas of gender, family, reproduction, etc., becomes foundational aspects of fighting militarism and vice versa. It isn't surprising that such a profound insight emerged from the positionalities that are so severely marginalized in heteropatriarchal societies. It is from the margins that the whole picture is clearly visible. Coming to my next example, to talk about the law. This year, 12 years on, we got a verdict for a survivor of gang rape. Her name has been changed. I'll call her Maya. The rape took place in 2013. The verdict declared that there was not enough evidence to convict the accused men. The judge was sympathetic to her situation, but said that evidentiary requirements were unmet, and so he could not pass a guilty verdict. The incident took place in my region in the east, a few years after the war had ended, while we continued to live under heavy militarization and surveillance. The accused were closely connected to armed groups, working in cahoots with the state at the time. It took a lot of courage for Maya to even make the complaint, and for us to accompany her for 12 years, holding on to nothing but some faith in the legal system. Within international law, sexual violence has been recognized as a war crime after much struggle. However, it is still seen as a state of exception rather than the norm. One of the most important feminist legal conceptual contributions grounded in grassroots activism in Sri Lanka come from one of my close colleagues and thinkers, Priya Thangaraja, where she argued that evidentiary processes made no distinction between war-related sexual violence and ordinary sexual violence. It is this that led to the men who raped Maya to be able to live with impunity. My final reflection today is that we need to nourish and sustain our movements. This also we discussed extensively in the convening in Batticaloa this year. On the one hand, we need to share these stories with the next generation, and on the other hand, we need to nourish and sustain our movements. We need to ensure that our stories and histories are not erased or pushed to the margins by hegemonic powers. In a small war-affected town where I live, we live surrounded by memories of loss, massacres, torture, enforced disappearance, and sexual violence. At the same time, we build every day on long-term feminist movements of survivors, sustaining our struggles through art, theater, peaceful public protests, memory gardens, and oral histories. To conclude, as feminist movements, we need to consolidate our analysis and our call to action by making connections. Firstly, the military-industrial complex can only be challenged by building solidarities and connections across movements, labor movements with environmental movements, for instance, and movements that question the foundation of normative gender, sexuality, and family. Secondly, the critique of heteronormative structures of family, reproductive sexuality, and so many other aspects of our intimate lives is imperative to question our acceptance of militarism and its gender roles and its justification as the response to disasters, for example, for the military to be the defense of community, nation, and family. We cannot build effective campaigns addressing big stakeholders without making the connections between the different normative structures of gender, sexuality, reproduction, family, community, market, and nation state. The dismantling of each of them is connected to the dismantling of others. As for the law, international law included, laws that we rely on for accountability. As feminist movements, we need to listen, learn, engage, critique, and envision scholarship that will benefit our movements through and to continue through continuous conversations. We'll need to learn from each other's struggles, from our legal battles, and collectively rethink concepts of justice, accountability, and impunity. And like the experience from Sri Lanka contributes, if militarism is not a state of exemption, if it is the norm, then how do we also rethink our ideas around law, which we depend on in our fights for justice and peace? Nuanced and grounded scholarship on sexual violence during conflict, for example, should be an essential element in our advocacy against militarization. In our understanding for peace, justice, rights, and law, I feel that our questioning of all the normative structures, our understanding of the role of labor, especially in the countries that of the global south, and in this case Asia Pacific region, and how we can make those connections with our allies, with other movements, are the ways forward in our journey towards challenging the big military industrial complex. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarala, for laying that very important analysis of, how personal is political and how militarized regimes not just control the nation state, but also the other normative structures that we all operate in, and how, it's the labor of the global south that's really building the military industrial complex, and the need for diverse movements to come together to really, tackle the menace of militarism and imperialism from our region. Thanks to all the speakers. We are all done with our presentations now, and we would like to have some time for the Q&A session. If you have any questions, you can either raise your hand or put it in the Q&A box or the chat. We had one from Sarala raising on, how the labor is sourced for the military industries. I think it was addressed to Shah, but unfortunately Shah could not be there for the second half. There any more questions to any of our panelists? Yeah, if all of our panelists could turn on their cameras, that would be really helpful. We see no questions in the chat box or the Q&A. Please feel free to raise your hands if you want to ask questions. Yeah, I see one comment on the data from CIPRI and how do we analyze the interlinkages of current financing mechanisms, mostly led by the global north, such as blended financing, which basically is saying that the global north does not want to fulfill the ODA targets anymore, but will instead tap private sector vis-a-vis the NATO government targets to increase military budgets allocation in the GDP by 2035. Yeah, thanks for that comment. We really see also a lot of global north nations, especially the US, for example, pulling out from mechanisms such as co-op and obviously ODA, to really focus on building more and more militaries, NATO being there as the prime example. And we earlier saw how our countries as well in the Asia Pacific are ramping up their militaries, and there really is an arms race. It's really uncertain where this is going to go, but we can already see a lot of repercussions. We saw it in Gaza. There's a threat in Venezuela, and Asia Pacific is really going to be at the core of what we call as the new Cold War. Here we have one question from Ananya. So Ananya is asking us, can you explain how militarism can help tackle sudden terrorism outburst and causing human life loss? Is this question addressed to any specific panelists? Okay, if not, if somebody wants to go ahead with the question, wants to answer this, can you explain how militarism can help tackle sudden terrorism outbursts?
Shall I go ahead, Kamakshi?
Yes, Azra.
This question about terrorism is actually a very loaded question, because it's well understood that a terrorist for one group could be a freedom fighter for another. So the attack from Hamas or the Palestinian resistance on 7th of October, the northern countries, the imperialist countries, continue to call it a terrorist attack to this day. And we in the South consider it a response to more than 75 years of occupation, of 20 years of the siege, where food was not being allowed in quantities sufficient for adequate nutrition of the people inside Gaza Strip. production was limited, trade was limited, people could not move out even to seek medical health or to get higher education. So the question of terrorism really needs to be looked in the context of imperialism. Um, society will erupt if rights are not met. If I'm very peace loving, but somebody slaps me or rapes me or rapes my child or rapes the community in which I live, my context of peace may be very different from being just talking about peace when there is when people talk about terrorism, we have these sudden outbursts uh, of what the person is calling terrorism, and who develops the weapons that are used is the most critical question. No, if there were no weapons there, they could not really create this kind of terrorist attacks which are happening. And in the face of rising profits, uh, Chow just showed us the immense profits of these weapon industry in these past years as conflicts and wars have escalated. So it's really, we need to keep going back to the issue of who's responsible, who are the imperialists, what is at stake for them, and why are people standing up to fight? When we fight, when we respond, then we are called terrorists. In my country, if we walk on the street holding something which is anti-US, we are considered terrorists. Inside Germany, inside US right now, people standing up to fight against fascism, against what is happening to the migrants in the United States and in many parts of Europe. What are they being called? They're being called terrorists. Right now in UK, 33 people are political prisoners and they're on hunger strike. Many of them are being now hospitalized simply because they were asking for albeit the Israeli weapon industry to be shut down. So I will stop there. I think it's fine to ask these questions. It is critical to ask these questions, but we have to keep on analyzing where does this terminology come from. Thank you.
Thanks, Hazra, for sharing your comments on the question. We have a couple of more questions, and specifically related to the interconnection between militarization and the climate crisis. One specifically for Sarala to really highlight, the militarization of climate crisis and related relief efforts. If you could elaborate more on that, and how do you see its consequences, and what could be the alternative solutions? And another related one also from Cassini, to know, if there's any concrete evidence linking the military and climate change that specifically affects women in the Asia Pacific region. So Sarala and maybe later Nick can, help us understand the interconnection between militarization and the climate crisis, or, the disaster that we face, for example, in Sri Lanka right now and many other countries as well.
Yeah, just to add to what Azra said, I think the part of that question I will focus on is the sudden. I don't think there's anything sudden about various violent, armed political acts that happen, which are really terrible. But I would agree that the discourse, the word itself, terrorism, and the discourse around terrorism has a political context, and we need to understand where the terminology came from. And I say this for example, in my town in Sri Lanka in 2019, there were attacks in churches. It's called the Easter Sunday bombs. And the people who did the attacks were labeled as terrorists. But our response as feminists, as women's movement, had been to understand the political economy behind the emergence of such movements, of such ideologies, and giving that understanding, it helps us to think through. You asked what to do, right? It helps us to think through what we need to push for in terms of addressing the structural issues that lead to such movements emerging, right? So it's very much connected to the extractive kind of capitalist market economies we live in, rising inequalities and poverty in our contexts, uh, degradation and destruction of environments, etc. And when it comes and it was really important for us to also see the role of women within such movements, the role of women who are affected by such movements, and to understand culture, understand particularly political economy in how these movements emerge and what are the kind of root causes so we can address the root causes. I think that's the only way. Um, Similarly to disasters, I think why we are relying on the military is that Sri Lanka is just, I mean, it's been 15 years, but most of my life has been a war. And the most efficient um, structures, let's say, are the military, right? Has always been for the last 30, 40 years and continues to be. And if we don't invest in other structures, imagine differently with community participation, which are democratic, which are elected, which have the skills and resources and the knowledge to respond in situations like this. Of course, we are going to rely on the military because the state, for example, has not been investing on responding to climate disasters or even creating economies and responding to nature and protecting nature in ways that won't lead to climate disasters, right? So then when crisis hits, yes, you rely on the same kind of efficient ways of thinking, notions of masculinity, heroic kind of, there's so many heroes. I'm not underplaying the importance of the role of what those individuals are doing in terms of rescue operations. But what I'm saying is we are relying on that form of responding because we have not built any other kind of alternative forms of responding to more and more crises. And it's really important to do that. And that was my point about how we look at how it's very much inside how we understand our own families, how we understand masculinity, how we bring up our sons, brothers who are heroes, what are our computer games, what is our kind of artistic kind of uh, characters that we resort to. It is very much in our imagination and psyche as well. So unless we give an alternative to that actively, the culture of militarism we've all taken for granted, right? So, and then that kind of reinforces the fact that when disaster happens, yeah, it's the military who is going to step in. Every single movie we've watched, it's the military that responds to disasters, right? Have you seen a really well functioning, democratically elected kind of civil forces responding to climate disasters kind of movie? It may not even make profit, I suppose, because we love that idea of the military response, right? So I think my experience now, I'm watching it that we don't have a choice. Even the COVID response in Sri Lanka was done by the military, done very efficiently, and it's seen as one of the best rollouts of vaccines, etc. Right? Um, and we are relying on the military again. And it goes along with emergency laws. Emergency has been declared. So it's like centralizing power, right? And the danger of it is the military responses don't follow the same protocols as civil administration. They have a different governance structure. At the end of the day, they are also this kind of structure of the state, which has so much weapons power also behind them, right? And at the moment, there's collaboration with the state, but like it's always unsure, right? At the end of the day, who makes the final decision, the final call? And um, this time around, we don't have an alternative in my country, but I think we need to work. The more and more disasters we are going to see, we need to call for strengthening civilian administrative structures to be able to do the preventative work, but also the response work when it comes to disasters.
If I could add to that, I think that, as a place too that experiences superstorms, super typhoons, we see a militarized response right away, but at the same time, we really need to remember or really also uplift the where the civilian responses do exist, where the indigenous responses exist outside of the military complex, and we have examples of that here. We helped send planefuls of items to the island of Tinian when it was devastated by super typhoon Yutu a few years ago, and we were devastated by a typhoon here just in 2023, and again, seeing like local response in contrast to the military response, it was really good, but it's easy to erase, it's easy to overlook. And then, of course, we see the diversion of resources that are necessary for recovery from typhoons diverted to military. That happens as well. We saw it here after the super typhoons. We couldn't get trucks to clear debris. We couldn't get dumpsters because all of that stuff was still being diverted to the base for construction as a priority from storm recovery. And I think that there's the risks for women. Well, we all talk about APWLD talks about how the risks for women and girls, children, are exacerbated during any crises, any climate crisis or any war, where there's instability, where there's displacement, where there's a huge casualty loss, where the crisis makes all of the existing challenges greater, all of the vulnerabilities greater. So that includes sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and violence against women and children. And of course, we see that in a military context as well, in that militarized response to crisis. It's happened throughout history. It happens every day. And so there's a lot that has been studied now to see how women and children are more vulnerable after climate, after a storm, after a flood, after a war. And it's really an honor to be here with these panelists who've all survived these things, witnessed these things happening in our own homelands, and how women have responded, how communities have responded in a lot of ways better than the military response, because it's done with cultural understanding and connection to a network and to the land that the military lacks. And so we see that in various efforts, whether it's sometimes people sharing seeds or sharing food that fell from trees after storm, or helping people clean or rebuild, or gathering donations, gathering relief, redistributing those things. That there are grassroots and indigenous efforts counter the military that we need to really figure out how to sustain. Sustainability is an issue. People are exhausted. People are feeling hopeless, and truly the demands of capitalism are hard for our people to just deal with everyday survival and recovery from some of these things. And so everything is exacerbated for women and girls. And so I just wanted to add those comments. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarala and Nate, to share, and specifically on a point of investing in civilian mechanisms for disaster relief. When we have already seen, countries like Sri Lanka and even India being impacted by tsunami before, which was a huge, disaster. But even then, we see expenditures going towards militaries, and rather than, developing civil mechanisms, and how then every response is like a militarized response. So yeah, thanks for highlighting from your grassroots experience. I hope they were able to, answer the question. We have, I think, one last question. If anybody would like to take. So one of our attendees is asking can you elaborate more on the impact of Russian imperialism for Asia Pacific. Maybe Azra or Jones, in case you would want to respond to that question.
There is, of course, cost of Russian imperialism in the Asia Pacific region. But I would emphasize, in contrast to the US, it is really, it doesn't have such huge footprints as the United States. But part of it is, of course, we can see that a lot of the weapons which India is buying for not only, for its acts against the people under occupied Kashmir, but also they are using those weapons against their own people inside the country. So many operations the military operations have been undertaken against the Adivasis, in the name of, again, communists, in the name of Naxalites, and so on. But in the end, it's about who has more force. So a very clear enunciation, of course, is inside inside India itself. In Central Asia, we don't have anybody here from Central Asia, but Central Asian women will talk about the impact of Russia very clearly in terms of how they control the political space in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, in many of the regions which are part of the Soviet Union and have now been separated into independent nation states. It's a similar game as the US, but because they have a much smaller political force, you don't see it. I talked about in Africa in how the Russians have actually taken up a naval facility in Sudan, and all areas which are geographically which have geopolitical importance for, especially for trade, and then for resources, whether it is critical minerals, as Nick talked about, and I talked about NATO coming out with a list of 12 very critical minerals. All of these countries will go to these areas and try to appropriate their resources. So I won't say anymore. I do not have much expertise in studying what Russia is doing in Central Asia. And I hope that we should really be able to develop that kind of an analysis also for our region, to be more well aware of the forces working against the people.
Thanks, Azra. So really, it's really to understand, the structures of imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism that are really perpetuating militarism and the actors who are playing by the rules of it. I see Asel's comments. In case Asel you would like to add or share anything from the perspective of Central Asia. Can we unmute Asel in case she wants to add?
Can you hear me, Kamakshi?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hi everyone, I am Asel, I am from Kyrgyzstan. Thank you for this webinar, and thanks Azra for mentioning about our realities in the Central Asia. And all of our countries now we faced with shrinking space for civil society. And here we have my sisters from Kazakhstan, Svetlana, and we saw that also feminist and women organizations in crisis now, especially that we protect women human rights. And we see attacks in social media, in Facebook, for if we write something about militarism, about internal external debts, we have some not good attitude to us from the government. And also we have we host countries 1 week ago, and it was a meeting of Organization for for Common Security. It's a military union where we have Russia, Kyrgyzstan, we have Kazakhstan. It's in Russian. It's ODKB. It's a military union with the post-Soviet Union countries and led by Russia. And yeah, we have also military union with China, and in our countries we have also military trainings, and now we have also decreasing the military issues like control, like many checkings in boards, especially many checking for activists who are going abroad, and we have also some new legislation changings where journalists and activists, human rights bloggers, and LGBTQ activists, they are also they have some legislation against these groups. We see that, for example, in Kazakhstan, they have some criminal code changes against LGBTQ activists, like Feminist organization. They are under attack, and now, yesterday we have a webinar in the frame of 16 days of activism against violence against women and girls, and we share our some troubles and our crises that we face now, and we stay in solidarity with each other, but still we need some support for feminist and for women groups, because if we have registration, we face we face really discrimination from the face of our tax offices, from our government offices. So, and yeah, this webinar is very important because we speak about political and economic and social analysis. It's very important to women to build our capacity in this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing the perspective from Central Asia as well. Adds to our conversation. We don't have any more questions, and we're also running past 5 minutes, our schedule, 8 minutes, sorry, our scheduled time. I hope it was important learning for all of you through this webinar, and please stay tuned to APWLD social media and our mailing list, because APWLD, as you know, as a feminist and anti-imperialist organization, is an organization rooted in women's grassroots realities, is really building up, this analysis on militarism, its interconnections with, imperialism, but also other factors that impact women's human rights in the region. And we will be coming up with other important initiatives in the coming year in 2026 to really analyze and unpack the impact of militarism on women's human rights in Asia and the Pacific, and how to build solidarity and collective strategies to fight militarism and imperialism in our region, and interconnect with other movements, the economic equality movement, movements on labor rights, and really come together as collective solidarity. Thanks everyone. Thanks all the participants, and thanks so much to our panelists for giving in their time and joining in. All the participants who asked for the presentations will be emailing. We can email you the presentations from the ones that has been shared by the panelists or your emails. Thanks so much, everybody. Hope you have a good day. Thanks, everyone.